I used to think the worst thing a neighbor could do was be loud or rude. I was wrong, because the man living next door to us was watching our house every single night. My name is Ethan, and this happened last year when my fiance and I bought our first home. I used to believe that the most dangerous thing about buying your first home was the mortgage, the paperwork, the stress, the fear of making a mistake you couldn't undo. I was wrong. The most dangerous part was the man living 10 feet away from us, the one who watched our house in silence night after night until we realized we were never really alone. Looking back now, there were signs, clear ones, the kind people always talk about after something terrible happens. The truth is, we saw them too. We just didn't want to believe them, because when you finally own a home, when you finally feel like you've made it, the last thing you want to admit is that you might not be safe inside it. My name is Ethan, and this happened last year when my fiance and I bought our first starter home together. Before I continue, if you enjoy true, real-life horror stories that could happen to anyone, consider subscribing to the channel. It genuinely helps support the work that goes into sharing these stories, and it helps make sure more of them get told. We were a young Asian couple, both in our late 20s, and buying that house felt like crossing some invisible finish line. It was a modest 2-story place in a quiet suburban town in Georgia. Nothing fancy. Beige siding, a small backyard, a thin wooden fence separating us from the neighbors. But to us, it wasn't just a house. It was a future, a place where we imagined holidays, pets, maybe kids one day. The street looked exactly like you'd expect. Neatly trimmed lawns, driveways with sedans and pickup trucks, porch lights that turned on automatically at dusk. The kind of neighborhood where nothing ever seemed to happen. And for the first few days, nothing did. We unpacked boxes, argued playfully over where furniture should go, and met a few neighbors. The couple on our right brought over cookies and asked polite questions. The man across the street waved every morning when I left for work. Everything felt normal, except the house on our left. We didn't see anyone come out of it. Not once. No trash bins rolling out on collection day. No lights turning on at night. The curtains were always shut tight against the windows, like the house was holding its breath. There was a car in the driveway, though, an older sedan that never seemed to move. At first, we joked about it. Maybe they worked nights, maybe they traveled a lot. Not everyone is social. We told ourselves it was nothing. Then one afternoon, while carrying groceries inside, my fiancée squeezed my arm. "Do you see that?" she whispered. I followed her gaze and froze. A man was standing behind the front window of the house next door. Only half of his face was visible through a slight gap in the curtain, but it was enough. He wasn't moving. He wasn't waving. He was just watching us. The second our eyes met, the curtain snapped shut and he disappeared. It startled me, but I brushed it off. I didn't want to be the guy who overreacted. People are awkward. Maybe he didn't want to be seen. Still, that image stuck with me longer than I expected. Over the next week, we started noticing him more. Not outside, never outside, inside. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of him standing in his living room window as I backed out of the driveway in the morning. My fiancée said she saw him once upstairs when she checked the mailbox. Every time it was the same pattern. He'd be there, still quiet. And the moment he realized we noticed, he vanished. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't obvious, and somehow that made it worse. One night close to midnight, everything shifted. I was getting ready for bed and passed by our upstairs window. Our bedroom faced directly toward his. Out of habit, I glanced over. He was standing there, fully visible, no curtain, no shadows, just standing in his upstairs window, staring straight into our bedroom. I remember my body going cold. My mind tried to rationalize it, tried to convince me I was misinterpreting what I was seeing. But before I could look away, he noticed me, and he stepped back, slowly, like he'd been caught doing something he wasn't supposed to be doing. I laughed it off out loud, mostly to convince myself I wasn't scared. I told my fiancée something like, "Great, our neighbor's a creep." We both laughed, but neither of us slept well that night. The next morning, there was a knock at our door. It was him, the first time we'd ever seen him outside. He introduced himself as Richard. He was polite, calm. He apologized for looking strange the night before and said he'd been fixing something near his window. He smiled the entire time, and on the surface, it should have been reassuring. But something about it felt rehearsed. His eyes didn't match the smile. Still, I accepted the apology. I didn't want conflict. When I went back inside, I told my fiancée he seemed okay. A little odd, but okay. We decided to forget about it. A week later, she woke me up in the middle of the night. "There's someone in the yard," she whispered. I didn't want to believe her, but when I looked out the window, I saw movement. A figure walking along our fence line, slow and deliberate, like he was searching for something. Without thinking, I shouted out. The figure immediately turned and rushed toward the gate, slamming it shut behind him. I didn't go outside. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a drunk neighbor, maybe kids. A few nights later, it happened again. This time we both heard it, a sound like metal shifting, like someone messing with a latch. When I looked out the window, my heart dropped. It was him, Richard. I yelled his name. He didn't respond, he just walked away unbothered. I confronted him that night. He answered his door almost instantly, smiling like he'd been waiting. He admitted it was him in our yard, claimed he was chasing off trespassers. "Kids," he said. Said it happened all the time and we'd get used to it. I didn't believe him. A few days later, he invited us over for dinner. We said yes, hoping to ease the tension. That was a mistake. The night started awkward and ended ugly. He drank too much, made comments about how he knew we liked Chinese food, laughed too hard at his own jokes. Eventually, the comments turned bitter, angry. He talked about the neighborhood, about who it used to belong to. Then he told us openly that we didn't belong there. We left without saying a word. After that, we avoided him completely, until the night a brick came crashing through our living room window. Glass everywhere, no note, no message, just a warning. The police couldn't do anything, no proof, just a report. 2 months after buying our dream home, we packed our lives back into boxes and left. Some people might call that giving up. I call it surviving, because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is lock your doors and walk away. The night I knocked on my neighbor's door is something I still replay in my head more often than I want to admit, not because I regret doing it, but because of how close I came to not doing it. There's a version of this story where I mind my own business, close my blinds, and go to bed. In that version, I live a quieter life, a more comfortable one, but someone else might not have survived. My name is Daniel, and this happened a few years ago, shortly after my wife and I moved into what we thought was the safest neighborhood we'd ever lived in. We had just gotten married and moved into a 2-story home in a calm Midwestern suburb, the kind of place where people jogged with strollers, where lawns were trimmed on weekends, where porch lights stayed on late into the night. We chose it because it felt peaceful, predictable, safe. The neighbors welcomed us quickly. especially the couple who lived to our right. The husband's name was Mark. His wife was Allison. They were friendly, warm, the kind of people who smiled easily and asked questions that felt genuine. A few days after we moved in, Allison knocked on our door with a homemade cake, laughing about how she always baked too much when she was nervous. We ate dinner together that first week, talked about work, travel, and how lucky we all felt to be where we were. If you asked me back then, I would have told you they were exactly the kind of neighbors you hope to have. That illusion lasted about 3 weeks. The first sign something was wrong came late one night. It was close to 11 p.m. when I heard raised voices outside. I stood up from bed and walked to the window, but I couldn't see much. The sound was coming from Mark and Allison's house. The argument was muffled but intense. Not playful, not normal bickering. The kind of tone that made my stomach tighten. A few minutes later, I saw Allison storm out the front door, get into her car, and drive away. By morning, everything seemed normal again. No police, no visible damage. I told my wife about it, and we both agreed it was probably just a rough argument. Every couple has them. We didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the arguments kept happening. Sometimes late at night, sometimes early in the evening. Always heated, always loud enough that we could hear them even with our windows closed. And then, suddenly, they stopped. Allison's car disappeared. At first, I assumed she was visiting family. But days passed, then a week, then 2. Her car never returned. Mark was still around, though. I saw him come and go occasionally. But he looked different, avoidant. Whenever our paths crossed, he didn't make eye contact. The friendly wave was gone. If I tried to speak to him, he answered quickly and excused himself like he was late for something. He looked thinner, nervous, like he hadn't slept. My wife noticed it too. Something's not right, she said one night. She was right, but neither of us wanted to say it out loud. After 3 weeks of Allison being gone, curiosity finally overpowered caution. I told myself I just wanted to check in, make sure everything was okay. That was the excuse I used to justify walking over to their house one afternoon. I rang the doorbell. Nothing. I waited. Rang it again. It took almost 3 full minutes before the door opened. Mark stood there, breathing hard. Sweat clung to his forehead like he'd just finished running. His smile was forced, stretched tight across his face. "Hey," he said too quickly. I asked him how he was doing. Asked about Allison. He hesitated before answering, his eyes darting somewhere behind me. She's staying with her mom for a while," he said. "Out of state. She's sick." The explanation didn't sit right. Not because it was impossible, but because of how badly he delivered it. He stumbled over his words, like he hadn't practiced the lie enough. I asked why he was sweating so much. He laughed nervously and said he'd been working out upstairs. And then I heard it, a sound from inside the house. A scream. It was faint, short, but unmistakable. A woman's voice. My heart dropped into my stomach. I asked him what that was. He froze for half a second too long before saying, "Oh, that. Just a movie." I forgot to pause. It didn't make sense. He just said he was working out upstairs. I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse him. I nodded, said okay, and walked back home with my chest pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. I told my wife everything. The sweating, the scream, the lies. She didn't hesitate. "You need to call the police," she said. I didn't want to be wrong. I didn't want to be the neighbor who overreacted. But I also knew I would never forgive myself if I ignored it. So I called. I asked to stay anonymous. I told the dispatcher exactly what I heard and requested a welfare check. About 10 minutes later, police cars pulled onto our street, then more, then an ambulance. My wife and I stepped outside as officers flooded the area. Mark was escorted out of his house in handcuffs, yelling incoherently. Moments later, Allison was carried out on a stretcher, barely conscious, her body covered in blankets. We learned the truth over the next few days. Mark had been abusing Allison for years. When she tried to leave, he locked her in the basement. For weeks, he sold her car to make it look like she was gone. That scream I heard, that was the moment she tried to make noise while he was answering the door. He stabbed her to silence her. She didn't survive. When Mark was being taken away, he looked directly at me and said, "I know it was you." I still hear that sometimes when the house gets too quiet. Justice was served. He went to prison, but the feeling of safety never fully returned. We moved a year later, because sometimes the scariest part of living next to a monster is realizing how close you came to never noticing at all. Living alone was supposed to feel empowering. That's what I told myself when I signed the lease. I was 24, freshly promoted, and finally able to afford my own place in Queens, New York. It wasn't fancy, just one side of an old duplex that looked like it had been split straight down the middle decades ago. 2 front doors, 1 thin wall separating me from whoever lived next door, but it was mine. The landlord mentioned the neighbor briefly when he handed me the keys. A man, quiet, worked nights, kept to himself. That didn't bother me. In New York, privacy was a luxury, silence even more so. For the first week, everything felt normal. I worked long hours, came home exhausted, heated up something quick, and went to bed scrolling on my phone until sleep took over. Occasionally, I heard faint movement through the wall, footsteps, a drawer opening, the muffled sound of a TV. Nothing unusual. Then one night, I heard his voice. At least, I think it was his. I was lying in bed around midnight when a strange sound drifted through the wall. It sounded like a man talking, but something about it was wrong. The pitch was too high, almost exaggerated, like someone forcing their voice into something it wasn't meant to be. I couldn't make out the words, just soft mumbling. At first, I told myself he was on the phone, or maybe watching a movie. I turned over and tried to sleep. Eventually, the sound stopped. A few nights later, it came back louder this time. I pressed my ear gently against the wall, half curious, half uneasy. The voice wasn't responding to anyone. There were pauses, then more words. It felt like he was talking to himself. I remember thinking how thin the wall was, how close he was, how little space separated us. That was the first night I realized I didn't like living there alone. 2 weeks later, the knocking started. I was drifting in and out of sleep when I heard 2 soft taps on the wall right beside my head. I jolted upright, my heart racing. I waited, holding my breath. 2 more taps, same rhythm, same spot. I rolled away from the wall and sat there shaking, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Pipes, the building settling, anything that didn't involve intent. The next morning, I told myself I was overreacting, but the knocks didn't stop. They happened almost every night after that. Sometimes soft, sometimes harder, always deliberate, always when I was in bed, always close enough that I felt like someone was standing inches from me. I tried headphones, white noise, a fan. Nothing helped completely. What scared me most wasn't the sound itself, it was the timing, the precision, like he knew exactly when I was lying down. One night, it went on for so long that I lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about how close he was on the other side of that wall. 2 feet, maybe less. If he leaned against it, we'd practically be back to back. That thought stayed with me. Then came the night everything changed. I was lying on my side facing the wall, eyes closed but not asleep. The room was dim, lit only by the streetlight filtering through the blinds. I heard 3 slow knocks. Tap, tap, tap. I stayed still. Then the voice came through the wall again, clearer than ever. "What are you doing in there?" my lungs locked up. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't mumbling. He was speaking directly to me. I sat up so fast I felt dizzy. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and called my boyfriend. I whispered everything, my voice cracking as I tried to explain. He told me he was on his way and that he'd stay the night. I turned on every light and didn't move until he arrived. Nothing happened that night. And somehow, that was worse. It made me feel like I'd imagined it all, like maybe fear had filled in the blanks. For a few days, things were quiet. No knocking, no voice. I started to relax. Then, a few nights later, I woke up abruptly. I don't know what time it was. I just know I woke up instantly, like something had snapped me awake. I barely had time to orient myself before the knocking started again. Rapid this time, fingers drumming against the wall right beside my head. I panicked. I screamed back without thinking, shouting for him to leave me alone. The room fell silent. For half a second, I felt stupid, embarrassed. Then a voice spoke from inside my room. Go to sleep. It wasn't muffled. It wasn't distant. It was deep, calm, close enough that I felt it in my chest. I didn't think. I didn't grab anything. I ran. I launched out of bed, sprinted down the stairs, and burst out the front door screaming. A man 2 houses down came outside, confused and alarmed. I begged him to let me use his phone, but he told me I needed to call the police. So I did. I waited there, shaking uncontrollably, until they arrived. When the officers walked me back to my duplex, my front door was still wide open. I had no memory of unlocking it. They searched the entire house, every room, every closet, under the bed. No one was there. They knocked on my neighbor's door. No answer. It looked like no one was home. My boyfriend arrived shortly after and took me back to his place. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I called my landlord and demanded answers. I told him everything and said I was breaking the lease. He pushed back at first. Paperwork, notice, rules. I told him I would never step foot in that house alone again. By the end of the day, he agreed. Over the next few days, my boyfriend came with me every time I went back to move my things. We tried knocking on the neighbor's door again. Still no answer. Packages piled up. A car sat in the driveway, but no response. Weeks later, the landlord told me the neighbor had moved out without notice. No forwarding address. No explanation. I still don't know if someone was truly in my room that night. I don't know if fear filled in the gaps, or if something happened that the police never found. What I do know is this: some walls are thinner than you think, and sometimes the most terrifying sound isn't what comes through the wall. It's the voice that comes from inside your room. When people think about danger, they imagine dark alleys, strangers, or places they'd never willingly go. They don't imagine driveways they pass every day. They don't imagine shared fences, thin walls, or front doors just a few steps away. But every story you've heard tonight has one thing in common. The fear didn't come from far away. It came from next door, from the man who watched silently through his window, from the house that went quiet when it never should have, from the voice that crossed a wall and erased the last sense of safety. These weren't monsters hiding in the dark. They were neighbors, people who waved, people who smiled, people who blended in so well that no one thought to look closer. And that's what makes these stories linger, because safety isn't just about locks and alarms. It's about listening to that quiet feeling in your chest when something doesn't feel right. It's about trusting your instincts, even when logic tells you not to make a fuss. It's about understanding that walking away, speaking up, or asking for help isn't weakness, it's survival. Every person in these stories lived, not because they were fearless, but because, at some point, they chose to listen to fear instead of ignoring it. So tonight, when you lock your door, don't do it out of paranoia. do it out of awareness, out of respect for yourself and the life you're protecting. And if this video made you think, if it made you pause, if it made you feel even slightly more alert than before, then these stories did what they were meant to do. Stay aware, stay safe, and never forget you never truly know who lives next door.